In the previous parts of this series, I've talked about how liberals manage to move themselves to innocence, while escalating our deadly and destructive, or inherently genocidal, system, and how this purely fictitious self-repositioning to the left leads to the erasure and vicious attacks on those who are actually there. In this episode, I'll have a closer look at the rhetorical structures of their personal attacks that blame their victims. In other words, shift the responsibility for our ever-escalating system away from the system, the Democrats who promote this Necroliberal system, and those who vote for it because it privileges them over it. So away from the most powerful and privileged onto the most targeted by this system.
Welcome to Deconstructing Necroliberalism.
Ad hominem attacks are invalid, irrational, fake arguments against the speaker or other people ad hominem that replace absent or weak, valid, rational and real arguments on the issue ad res. They are deflective fallacies of irrelevance. They do not only distract us from the actual issue in discussion, like what have the Democrats ever done for us, and how are they part of the escalating, impoverishing death machine? Even worse, they smear the system's victim, the potential third-party voters, most likely systemically more marginalized people, as well as third-party candidates, as untrustworthy and lacking credibility, simply as people you don't want to waste your time listening to. People you supposedly shouldn't listen to, because, like Cuba, they might actually offer you new and interesting perspectives, which really contradict the Dems and reveal their complicity in our systemic fascistization. They might introduce you to real alternatives to our system instead of the Dems' fake opposition to our fascistization. And sometimes so-called one-word stories like terrorist, Hamas-run, Iranian-backed, Russia-linked, or simply extremist, radical, crazy, or sentence stories like "you'll be responsible for fascism if you don't do what we want" can be enough to achieve that. And fascism, of course, is used here irrationally as an emotionalizing and hence rationalizing scare word, only applied to the other fascism, not the systemic one. Other times it will be condescending or otherwise dismissive phrases like the hegemonic and paternalistic "get off your moral high horse and do what serves us necroliberals." This dismissive wording, as you might have noticed, is not simply self-exonerating by implying that anti-fascists are not morally superior to those voting for fascistization. It implies that anti-fascists supposedly amorally, merely performatively seek a morally superior position without having one, unlike those voting for Dems for the supposedly greater good, that they are mere virtue signalers. In reality, it's of course those tweeting with Palestinian flags in their bios who still vote for the Palestinians' genocide, who are virtue signalers, not those who are consistent. So again, we have a clear reversal of victim and offender, or as some would say, every accusation is a confession. By no surprise, one of the most famous or infamous patterns of ad hominem attacks is scapegoating, which simply shifts the responsibility for the escalation of our deadly system onto someone else, some marginalized people, be it Haitians, migrants, Muslims, or third-party voters. Both major parties apply this fascist practice. In other debates, this appeals to fascist biologistic thinking as in all of them are like this and that. It's in their DNA to be emotional, aggressive and lazy. Or to equally fascist and supremacist culturalistic thinking of the same pattern as in it's in their culture, they are just lazy, we cannot afford them, build that wall. They'll take our jobs or live in our social benefit system. They basically rob us. Not the super rich wage and resources thieves, not our system. Them, the least powerful and the poorest. probably noticed that this always comes with authoritarian and hegemonically determining generalizations which imply stereotyping, ascribing all members of an outgroup certain characteristics. That is a form of thinking which requires othering, which in turn enables dehumanizations. With regard to third-party voting, we can already see that especially pro-Palestinian protesters, Muslim voters and black men who are immediately hyper-focused right now will most likely be blamed for Harris not winning the presidency, although it's solely her own fault that her politics don't serve the most basic needs of these groups, the promise to be led alive by our government. Additionally, othering is, as we've seen already, the basis for the horseshoe myth that leftists are like fascists, that leftists vote in such a way that fascists will win, while in reality it's of course liberals who vote for colonial fascism, which Necroliberalism is, and who are to blame for the further escalation of our colonial fascist or Necroliberal system, which many of you have experienced during the last 4 years and last 4 decades under Biden, Harris, Obama, and Clinton, be it in Flint, in being impoverished, in being disabled by a pandemic, let it rip policy, or through carp cities. Connected to othering and scapegoating is yet another pattern of fascist thinking, the idea of treason, of betrayal against your in-group, of traitorous behavior, simply motivated by supposed hatred against your in-group, rather than actual and factual reasons. This resembles the irrational denial of your resistance being resistance to systemic violence upheld by the speaker, but it's slightly different. Although it's two uses the surrogate explanation for deviations from the norm, you cannot possibly have real reasons for voting against Democrats, so they must be fake and dubious. Just like Palestinians cannot possibly resist an apartheid regime, but must be inherently anti-Semitic, when the fascism or the regime they are fighting is not recognized. But the traitorous critic fallacy means something else. It's just because you favor another group that your arguments are supposedly less valuable or even invalid. In the most obvious cases of the fallacy, you are even declared a bot or a Russian agent. It's just because you are a green or a socialist that your arguments will be dismissed. This one-word label is enough to make you untrustworthy and unworthy to be listened to. Similarly, it's just because you are Palestinian or a poor person that your perspective on our impoverishing system is classified as to be dismissed, no matter how rational and valid your arguments actually are, and instead of engaging with your arguments, you will be attacked as a mere hater. It's a vicious avoidance strategy. Even worse, when you are classified as traitorous, allegedly betraying the Dems, allegedly cheating them out of their victory, we all censor supremacist entitlement in this framework, then you are fascistly marked. Sometimes this egocentrism is masked as you are betraying the marginalized, which again is a reversal of victim and offender. The tendency to tell migrants or those not eligible to vote in the US to shut up about US elections, while welcoming supporting statements of like-minded genocide supporters like the European Greens, as if these elections wouldn't determine the course of the whole world, as if US voters wouldn't again and again confirm their ruling parties that they're basically fine with their imperial violence, also mark these marginalized voices as traitorous, for example, to American values of imperial mass murder. The more fascist they are, the more they will tend to view every view and every person contradicting them as traitorous. We know this pattern of thought very well from Nazi Germany. Everyone not voting for them and their party only is framed as evil, that is to be excluded at each cost, and be it in the undermining of third parties to be on the ballot or debate stage, or the elimination of primaries in favor of a coronation, or be it in explicit fantasies about violence committed against them when not following the Dems' orders to vote for them. I hope you get raped under Trump or deported, and that Palestinians will be genocided, even worse. I'm fed up with supporting these groups of Palestinians, Muslims and Queers who vote against our inherently genocidal system. Sounds awfully similar to, if you don't like our country, then leave. And if you damn queer person hate our love for Israel so much, go to Palestine. You've probably noticed what is also inherent in this fascist traitor thinking, the hegemonic paternalism I spoke about in the first part. In order to believe that third-party voters are betrayers or spoilers, and please notice the fascist dehumanizing conceptualization of third-party voters as sickening bacteria in this particular wording, it's necessary to think within an anti-democratic framework of entitlement to your vote, voice and body. Your submission, which again is only logical within the irrational self-repositioning and renaming of liberals as left-wing too. If they accepted that you are anti-liberal and on the left and they are on the right, just like Republicans, they could never ever make the claim that your third-party vote should have meant to be theirs. In other words, you are framed as traitorous against the Democratic Party, or put more concealed, more nicely, against those who are put forward as pretext, the marginalized, you, allegedly, unlike the colonial fascist Democrats, don't care for when you don't vote for them. You get smeared as allegedly throwing the most marginalized on the bus by not voting for Dems. I've got news for you. The marginalized have always been thrown under the bus by Dems, and hence by liberals voting for them. Just listen to the most marginalized. You might have been painted as having sinister motives or attitudes when advocating for third parties. You want Trump, again a reversal of victim and defender, exonerating the fascistizing Democrats and shifting the blame onto those who actually try to stop this system. Jill Stein has faced many of such ad hominem attacks, painting her as traitorous for wanting less systemic violence. Less systemic violence apparently is anti-American. She's frequently painted by liberals as being motivated to run for president by rather dubious reasons like alleged but debunked connections to Russia, for example, or as a grifter, which is again the reversal of victim and defender, because actually those profiting off of a highly deadly system are those who are grifters. And certainly those who'd otherwise be systemically marginalized people, black tokens, for example. On a side note, even if Jill Stein was directly paid by Russia, it wouldn't mean that her political arguments are any less valid or rational. That's exactly what the ad hominem fallacy makes you forced to believe. Listen to ad res arguments, not ad hominem framings. Now we've arrived at shoehorning, because you can indeed have so-called or homogenizing relabeled communist ideas without having any connection to communist countries or parties. You can criticize the US, its politics and its system fundamentally without being incentivized to do so by dubious foreign regimes or groups. You can simply be motivated by your very own devastating experiences with our own impoverishing death cult system. Or have listened to indigenous peoples you've been genociding for centuries. That Democrats frequently claim the opposite is further evidence of their fascist minds. Everyone protesting for Palestine as fulfilling Russia's or China's agenda is structurally the same as the old Cold War McCarthyist, everyone protesting against an impoverishing system for better social standards is agitated by the communist Soviets. In other words, everyone criticizing Earth and our superior system and party must have an evil agenda. It cannot be that we are evil. Frightening, because this thinking will definitely lead them to resort to fascism to defend their delusional supremacism and system. If you don't abide by their demands for assimilation and subjugation, you'll be smeared by conspiracist rumors or even debunked stories, distortions halved with our lies, which usually feed into fears and biases, stereotypes and generalizations. We know this strategy from poisoning the well, a preemptive ad hominem attack against an opponent in order to prime the audience with adverse information about the opponent from the start, in an attempt to make liberal viewpoints more acceptable and to discount the credibility of third-party advocates so that you won't even listen to them. One-word stories or otherwise simplistic and stereotypical claims may be enough to achieve that. And so it's basically somewhat like the opposite of the captatio benevolentia. Instead of flattering the audience at the beginning to manipulate it to view your opinion more favorably, it's manipulating the audience by attacking the contradicting people who speak later to the audience. Let me briefly tell you about a pattern of smearing groups, cultures and systems opposed to our colonial fascism or Necroliberalism. For centuries, one-word smears like barbarians, terrorists and later communists have done their service for our system. But did you know that the CIA, in collaboration with the Dutch Secret Service, created a Marxist party, turned it into a terror organization, and then smeared it as China-backed, so that they could discredit communism fundamentally, which had way more social standards to offer than our necroliberal system, and hence would have been more attractive without this manipulation. Back to smearing third-party voters. A common wording is single-issue voter, which falsely desystemizes genocide to an event, although it's systemic and pervasive. Smearing can come in the form of attaching unpleasant or unfavorable words or images to a person. Jill Stein, for example, is frequently pictured as sitting at the same table as Putin. However, this is, apart from a decontextualizing snapshot, simply exploiting irrational associative thinking. In reality, Stein and Putin haven't exchanged a single word during Putin's 1-minute stay at the table. Rather, Stein was talking to a German diplomat sitting next to her the whole time. Similarly, other people associated to certain groups are claimed to not act and not argue rationally, but on the basis of their group membership. They just advocate against them because their family was slaughtered by our system. They are too emotional, too self-centered, not having the authoritarian myth of the greater good in mind. You cannot take them seriously. You have to think about all the lies we save in comparison to Trump, which is a self-serving fiction, putting fantasies about own inconveniences affecting a few over the reality of existing murders of millions of other people, and a trade-off of human lives, which is by definition a fascist way of viewing life, known as statisticality. So this is related to the false and desystemizing genocide as a single-issue claim, rather than a system and death cult permanently applied by necroliberalism. On the other hand, liberals love to paternalistically associate marginalized people with the Dems' supposed leftism, so that they can claim, as a marginalized person, you're supposed to vote for us, because Trump will be worse for you. Last but not least, in this part about ad hominem attacks, they're the rhetorical tactic of dismissing a contradicting argument not on the basis of its factual claims, but based on who is making the argument. Dems sometimes claim your third-party argument to be flawed simply because you, or those or some of those making the argument, do not always act consistently with it. But you too voted for Biden 4 years ago. Voting third-party now only shows your desire for performative virtue signaling, because that's popular now. Or your vote for Stein won't achieve anything for Palestinians either. Your vote wouldn't end the genocide either. directly. So you're not morally superior to me. Although it's the only thing which actually tells Democrats that they cannot sacrifice every life without consequences, and thus pressure them to be a little bit more careful in the future. Again, such claims are A. a dismissing causal reductionism, and B. are cynically using Palestinians as a pretext to exonerate voting for genocide and its ramifications. To sum up this part, all these shifts of responsibility away from the system, the powerful and the privileged, onto powerless and marginalized individuals, away from the Democrats and their voters onto third-party voters, imply not only ad hominem attacks and distraction from the actual political issues, causes and systemicity of our problems, but also a move to innocence by the speaker, by those making these ad hominem attacks, by blaming the most powerless instead of their beloved party and system, which they help to uphold through voting for and thus confirming the Democrats again and again. They simultaneously manage to distract from and get rid of their own responsibility and entanglement in this brutal system. And particularly the accusation that you must be inherently evil to not vote for Dems is unfortunately not a confession, but you can indeed find the evilness on the side of the accuser, who shifts this evilness away from themselves, the colonial fascist, onto you, the anti-fascist. But while such ad hominem attacks, which are a deflection attempt in absence of a factual or strong argument, are also usually more covertly emotionalizing and rationalizing, there are way more overt forms of emotionalizing and rationalizing your thinking, which are also deflection attempts. I'll discuss them in the next episode of this series.